Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History By podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor John On. John On is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible at the Howard University School of Divinity. He is trained in ancient Near Eastern and religious studies. He holds the PhD in religious studies, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament from Yale University, and a Master of Sacred Theology from Yale Divinity School, and a Master's of Divinity in Princeton from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a Bachelor's of Arts in Linguistics and Religious Studies with honors from New York University, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. He specializes in the historical and social reconstructions of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE with interests to the 1st century CE. On is classically trained in ancient Near Eastern languages and history, text criticism, literature, and paleoclimatology. He also employs social scientific theories, including cultural memory, trauma, generational consciousness, economic theories, and forced and return migration studies to better understand the text's original and layered political, historical, social, literary rewriting, and religious cultural traditions of ancient Judah, Israel, for ancient and contemporary actualizations with canonical consciousness, fostering new knowledge. On was president of the Mid-Atlantic Society of Biblical Literature, SBL, from 2021 to 2022. He also served as the section review leader for Daniel and the Book of the 12 Minor Prophets, NRSV Updated Edition. And with that being said, John, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. Looking forward to this conversation, engaging whoever is online, and I think it's a timely subject matter. So thank you.
So for the first thing that I'd like to ask you before we get into what changed your mind about the dating of the Torah, and that is that instead of it being a text that formed in the perhaps either during the exile or post-exile, because there's a lot of different opinions about the dating of the formation of the Torah, even with those that hold the standard view, because you have now come to the view that the Torah, or at least in its final form, came to fruition in the 3rd century BC during the Hellenistic period. Who is Plato, for those that don't know much about him? Because Plato is going to be somebody we're going to be discussing quite a lot in this discussion, the Torah's use of Plato. So can you tell the audience a little bit about Plato?
So most of, hopefully the readers can just do a quick search on who Plato is, and they'll get an understanding of who Plato is. A prominent philosopher, prominent sort of a thinker who helped us to see the world the way that we do primarily through Western civilization. For me, or at least for the work of Hebrew Bible, there are 3 seminal works that Plato has done or produced, first while he was alive, the Republic, and then posthumously, one of his disciples completed the Laws, and again, another 3rd work called Epinomis. These 3 works are actually seminal for biblical scholars to help them to better understand the final form of the Hebrew Bible. It was an interesting question that you asked at the outset. What changed my mind in terms of the final edition or the final form of the canonized version of what we have as the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, at least the Torah or the Pentateuch section of it? And to help your audience or others who are listening in, think of the way that we construct dating and what a text is, or at least for those of us who have been religiously trained in the synagogue or in church or other places. Think of a pyramid now, at the base being, your basic orientation to what the text is, or what the Pentateuch or the Torah is from a synagogue or church perspective, that base level. And then you might take a college course, and it's the next level. And then let's say that you might do some further studies like in the grad school years, and then finally leaving off that final pyramid. Okay, so for me, I was exposed to all these information and knowledge as early on in the church world, growing up as a Presbyterian. And so Mosaic authorship is what was pounded on us. And of course, you grow up saying, oh, it's an inspired text that Moses wrote. The synagogue teaches the same thing. Until one day you take a class. And my first courses in Hebrew Bible Old Testament was with 2 Jewish professors at NYU, Lawrence Schiffman and Baruch Levine, and they were at odds with each other. And again, one saw the text another way and another saw the text another way. So I remember Larry Schiffman always saying there are contradictory facts to be true in his wonderful voice. And then Professor Levine say, no, this is there's a hypothesis to this. We call this the Pentateuchal sources. And so at an earlier age, at a very, very young age, you have to imagine a freshman in college getting caught between the two prominent, scholars. And so my idea, and then of course you begin to understand, the final form of the Pentateuch must be Persian because that's what they're saying. And then you go to grad school or seminary and additional studies, and they're all saying the Persian period, the Persian period. Again, what's seminal about studying the Pentateuch is scholars need to realize that the Pentateuchal studies is also connected to Isaianic studies for the longest time. And so when we study the work of the completed final form of the book of Isaiah, they go hand in hand together. So Isaianic redactions and all that versus the redactions and the multi-layering and the Pentateuchal studies, they go hand in hand. Okay, so the final top layer, because biblical scholars are so locked into what the mainstream scholastic view is, and we hear the word Persian or at most Greco-Persian, scholars get locked in. And so when you ask the question, okay, what changed your mind? So most of us, we struggle with this and we repeat what we hear from our freshman years in college all the way to our grad schools. And most scholars who specialize in these subject matters, they want to get published. They want to be recognized as a mainstream scholar, and they keep repeating the same thing cyclically over and over again. Case in point. But some of us never publish anything, okay? Why? Because some of the greatest mentors of the previous generation said, if you're not quite sure, don't publish anything. Continue to attend conferences, read, and think of the subject matters at large until you're ready, which means that we leave the last segment of the pyramid open-ended. And the more open-ended that you can leave that sort of thinking process or that scholastic opportunity. I've been on this journey since as a freshman in college. It's been 36 years now. In other words, my mind hasn't really sort of completely changed in one sense, but maybe it has. Maybe I was always seesawing between the Persian period and the Hellenistic period, but never having the courage to finally say, okay, the final form is in the Hellenistic period, not the Persian period. And so I love the way that you framed that question. What changed your mind? And I think the bottom sort of, or the most important thing is there's enough evidence now that I can pinpoint to say, okay, this is definitively a Persian period text because of Plato's work. It's always there. Most of us, we grow up reading Plato's Republic and all the other works, but to be able to say definitively, I see a lot of Platonic influences, especially in the book of Numbers or even in Exodus or in other places. I think that helps scholars. But again, critical scholars, we just stay in the box. And when we hear these grand names who are specialists in Pentateuchal studies, there's a tendency of just repeating what Thomas Roma has said or Conrad Schmidt has said, or what Erhard Bloom has said in the previous generation, or even Rolf Rentorf, or even on the North American side, what David Carr is saying, among others. And so scholars tend to sort of repeat what other scholars have said, especially at a younger age, until you finally realize that maybe we need to sort of free ourselves from these previous generations of scholarship. And again, I can go back to the minimalist versus the maximalist and that, but I think at this stage, we are far beyond the T.T. Thompsons and Peter Neal's Lemke and the Robert Carrolls and I'm sorry for dropping these names, but these are the folks that helped us initially at the early onset of the late mid-1990s to early 2000s to really see if the text was really Persian or Hellenistic. And it kind of got caught up in this sort of debate between maximalist and minimalist. In other words, maximalist meaning there's maximum history in the Bible versus minimalist. There's just a little bit or minimum history in the Bible. And because of that maximalist, minimalist debate, the larger issue of the final form of the Pentateuch being Hellenistic and Persian got caught up in this debate. And as a result, we just tended to sort of push ourselves into a different sort of conversation subject matter. But coming back to your initial inquiry on who and what and how Plato and who he is, again, the general sort of reader or the audience will know that he was a student of Socrates, and then Plato became teacher of Aristotle. Aristotle, again, the teacher of Alexander the Great. But Plato was the one that really helped us to see what education is, what Hellenism is, what teaching is, and what learning is, what divine inspiration is, and thinking about what an ideal society is. And foremost, the reason why I'm saying in a timely manner, what is good governance? What is civic society? What does it mean to have democracy? What is a tyrant? What is a citizen supposed to do in roles and in situations when there is tyranny going on, or some sort of abuse of a political system at large? And so here is Plato offering ideals, organizations, allocations, structure, what is pure, what is unclean, even what is the role of women, what about inheritance? And there are these grand big themes that Plato is interested in, and he now has helped us to sort of form social constructions of reality around these subject matters.
What kind of what are some of the examples that you can point to regarding the Torah's use and familiarity with Plato's laws?
Okay, great question. So I just said a few things a minute ago about, okay, so Plato's law basically talks about the origins of law. It's one big subject matter for Plato in the laws. And he says it's divinely inspired. In other words, he wants to say it's all about reason, but he attributes it to a higher being. Well, especially in the book of Numbers, you have to realize the book of Numbers is very, very unique. Sometimes scholars forget, or even non-specialists or specialists, the book of Numbers has a history of development itself. It's very, very difficult going back to Dennis Olson's dissertation. I think scholars can sort of see that. Also, Thomas Roma's work on the book of Numbers that brought the study of the book of Numbers to the forefront. But here, the origins of the law, you have to realize where the law is given. The law is given in the wilderness. So the question has always been, why in the wilderness? The entire historicity of ancient Israel has always been occupied the Assyrians, then the Neo-Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks split between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, except when you arrive at the Maccabean period where there's freedom for the first time. Never in the historicity of biblical Israel was there any moment when they were free from the hegemonies or the powers of being. The wilderness is the only place where there's no powers of the Persians, nor the Egyptians, nor any of the satellite nations holding power and control over ancient Israel. So the place that the law is given, divine inspiration law, is in the wilderness, where there's no powers, foreign powers. So origins of the law is divinely inspired in Plato's laws. In the book of Numbers, you see this law that's given to ancient Israel through Moses in the wilderness from Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So again, in the laws, there's this notion of what an ideal state is. I think it's called in the laws magnesia. Magnesia is not in the port or in the urban context. Here, Plato says urbanization is what has destroyed consciousness of what good civil society is. There's too much greed. There's corruption. You and I today, we would call conspicuous consumption. There's so much abuse of power in the port cities. Plato in the law says it should be like 10 miles outside of the port. And the exact ideal place for a new colony is the wilderness. Oh, why is there this new nation that's being established in the book of Numbers or Exodus 15 and following in the wilderness? Ideal state. The other thing is in the laws, you have at least three classes of societies: governors or rulers. You have the military, and then you have the producers, which is basically coming down from the Republic. But in the book of Numbers, it's reduced to just two groups of people, those who are governors and those who are in the military. What's brilliant here is the fact that the book of Numbers, or the Pentateuch, at least in this segment, has removed all forms of producers, the slaves. That entire sort of underclass of persons are ideally removed. So you only have two working classes of groups of people. It's an idealized state. But again, it's the wilderness that takes center stage. The book of Numbers deals with 12 tribes of Israel. Guess who actually started off with the 12 tribes in distinct sort of in book 5 and 745b, section 745b and e, Plato's laws. Again, there's this connotation about citizens being organized into 12 military units in laws. The exact same outset at the book of Numbers, the first few chapters. The entire community is established in north, south, east, and west. Once again, military structure. Once again, there's another fascinating sort of subject matter in the laws that pertain to the role of woman. What happens to the daughters of a man who has no son? Well, we have the story about the daughters of Zelophehad, who inherits land, and they are women. Again, in Numbers chapter 26 and 36, that sort of resurface. And there are several more places where we can sort of begin to see parallels. And once again, once we're able to see these parallels, and I'm not the first to see these, there are other scholars who've seen them, we can basically say that the book of Numbers is quite structurally dependent on the laws. Lastly, but not least, not just the laws, but in Epinomis, which is the last of the sort of the series that Plato has written, or at least posthumously, his disciple picked it up. At the very, very apex of learning this philosophia, or learning this sort of laws and wisdom, is arithmetic. But again, that arithmetic is basically playing with numbers. The book of Numbers plays with numbers. I know it sounds a little sort of catch-22, but again, whoever's playing with numbers, there's sort of divine mystery. And I'm not a numerologist. The last thing that I talk about numerology in classes. So like when you hear a sermon, or when you hear someone says, oh, there are 15 references to something, or 25 references to this word being used in the Bible, this and that, I'm like, great, you know how to count. Okay, that's sort of my answer. But again, I am the most anti-number person that you will find among scholars. But Epinomis is all about playing with numbers. Okay, 7 days of creation, there's a reason for that. 40 days, there's a reason for that. Again, the 600,000 groups of persons in the book of Numbers in the first census and the second census, with the 5,000 some odd numbers in the laws. Again, all these things point to evidence-based scholarship, points to stuff that's coming out of Plato's laws, Epinomis, and the Republic, and it's overwhelming evidence.
Some will try to say that, what about the Ketef Hinnom scrolls? Because one of the scrolls contains material that's also found in Numbers, and they'll try to say that that is evidence that Numbers as a whole is earlier, even though it's not Numbers as a whole. It's a small text with some material from Numbers, but that doesn't mean all of Numbers is earlier. So I've seen some try to use that as evidence against the late dating of the Torah. What do you make of that?
Oh, you're always going to have an earlier layer of the Pentateuch. It's just because we have these late redaction, I'm not saying that there are earlier layers. There are many, many layers to this document or this text that we have. Again, I briefly mentioned the book of Isaiah. There's an 8th century layer, 7th century layer in the book of Isaiah. There's a 6th century layer, a 5th century layer. There's multiple layers in the formation of the book of Isaiah. The Pentateuch, to simply say that we have just one layer of redactional layer, it's a misnomer. There are earlier traditions, earlier layers. And so if scholars want to date that earlier, I need to see more evidence, and I need to do a thorough investigation of that on my own. But again, I'm very cautious of any fragments that we find, any things that is outside certain textual communities. I need to see it for myself. I need to examine the text for myself, and I need to do a thorough examination before I come to a conclusion. I'm immediately of the opinion, of the thought, most of the stuff that we find today, not a lot, but most of it are forgeries for people just to make a name for themselves. So anytime we say, oh, we discovered a brand new text, we need to know where the collection is coming from. We need to know where the text is coming from, provenance, all those things. But again, with that sort of team scroll, again, I'm a little cautious, but if scholars want to say that we have earlier layers, of course, there's going to be earlier layers to the traditions that we have received. And for us to sort of arrive at the conclusion that just because we have a late dating of the Pentateuch does not take away from the fact that it started much earlier, at least during the Persian period. So it's not just when I'm saying that it's, or suggesting that it's the Hellenistic final form, the preliminary early form probably took much earlier on. And so let me give another quick example. Like in the book of Kings, there's a story about during the King Josiah's period that the book of the law, or whatever we want to call it, and some would say sections of the book of Deuteronomy is discovered, sure. Or we have even references to the book of the covenant. But you have to remember, that's not scripture. That's not canonical consciousness. It's whatever it is they find that is somewhat authoritative. But what I'm referring to in this final form, the final form is what many of the listeners, I hope, would say is the Bible, or scripture, or canon, canonical consciousness. That idea of the Bible, the idea of this being sacred literature that is binding for the worshiping community, that consciousness does not happen before the exile, Jacob. In other words, the idea that this is the Bible, there is no idea, concept, consciousness of scripture before the exile. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. The year 597, that's the last king of the southern kingdom of Judah's king, Jehoiakim. He gets displaced, goes into exile, into Babylon. 10 years later, 587, the temple is destroyed. For the first time, the community is now scattered, not just in Babylon, but probably another group goes down to Egypt, and then it's scattered across the coastlands, and even Moab, and across Edom, you name it, maybe to Midian as well too. So the community is all scattered. The authoritative word of the king no longer holds value, and the king doesn't have a position anymore. So for the first time, there's this consciousness that takes place. The authority of the king now becomes the authority of the text. Authority of the king now becomes the authority of God. For the first time, this authority, this important word of the king, now becomes the word of the text. Now, here's the brilliance of what the exilic editors or authors are doing. Now that binding thing is going to be this text that is from God. So the birth of the Hebrew Bible, the idea that this is a sacred text, would not have happened without the exile of the southern kingdom of Judah. 10 years later, temple is destroyed. External sacrifice becomes internalized. So every Shabbat, every Saturday, every Sunday, there's a memory of the 597 event, which is the birth of consciousness of scripture and prayer that sort of combines it together. Fast forward 33 AD, another Davidic king, last Davidic king for Christians, Jesus, as we interestingly enter into Palm Sunday for those who adhere to that. And then the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD gives birth to New Testament consciousness, canonical consciousness. The reason why I'm saying all this is because the way in which canonical consciousness helps us to understand is whatever that took place before the exile, it's an important text. There might be, whatever you want to call it, some sort of pre-canonical consciousness, but it's not scripture. It can only be scriptural consciousness or canonical consciousness beginning with the exilic marker. So the fact that we have this Bible or scripture, anything before 6th century is a misnomer. You cannot date the text before the 6th century. The starting point of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the fact that we can even talk about scripture before the exile, there's no canonical consciousness. So beginning from the 6th century BCE all the way to the Maccabean period, that's the actual, that close to 500-year period is when the scriptures are actually being canonized and being sort of formed together. And so why is Plato important? Why are the Hellenistic sort of ideas so important? It's the thinking, the reading, Hellenized Jews probably down in Egypt that is influencing a lot of the counter arguments of Ezra and Nehemiah, who's bringing a form of Ezra's Torah into the land at large. And so again, I'm answering and sort of taking your important question and opening it up in such a way to help scholars and even your audience to help follow along some of the more recent developments in biblical studies at large. But I hope that sort of helps shape our conversation maybe a little bit deeper here and there.
It definitely does. Now I'm going to ask the question, the flip side of what I asked before. So we have no evidence at all, like zero attestation for the Torah before the Hellenistic period. We would look at the Elephantine Papyri, nothing about even a version of it, just nothing at all. And all we have are, assuming that they're authentic, of course, these quasi-parallel texts with the Torah that are very, very small, not much to go off of, again, assuming that they're authentic, like the Ketephenome scrolls among a few others. And that's all we got. And on the one hand, one could say it's evidence that the Torah was written in layers, maybe. But on the other hand, one could say the Torah was using older texts and as sources, which from a certain point of view could also be viewed as layering, depending on how you want to interpret that evidence. So in other words, my question is, why believe any of it is older? How can one tell by looking at a text and say, okay, I can tell that this piece of it is older? Well, how do we really know that? What's the evidence for these hypothetical documents that they believe in the documentary hypothesis existing? Nothing like it is attested in the Elephantine Papyri, nowhere elsewhere. What is your thoughts on all of that?
Okay, brilliant question. I love that question at large. I get questions like this in our advanced seminars in Pentateuchal studies, or even in other courses at large, particularly in exile as forced migration. And so I think the Elephantine community is very important. In one of the exchanges, they don't even realize that that the Shabbat is actually being adhered to by the community. And they're doing all these businesses and all these transactions without really even thinking that the Sabbath, which is at the foundation of Torah observance, is taking place by a significant community that had a temple from 410, which got destroyed in 410 BCE. And they want to rebuild it. And there's no Shabbat consciousness. There's no Sabbath consciousness. One of the few internal evidences that we have of this sort of completed or incomplete Torah, Ezra's Torah, is when Ezra comes back and is reading this, and Nehemiah captures it and says, oh, they're reading this law that is binding for the community at large. Okay, so for scholars, and then there's one more internal evidence that talks about at least some sort of a Torah, which is in the book of Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah. There's an Isaianic Torah with broad strokes of some sort of creation motif, some sort of an Exodus motif, and some sort of a wandering motif, at least according to what Marvin Sweeney and other scholars have noticed. And Ezra, rather, an Isaianic Torah, which is just broad strokes. So when we begin to recognize the different sources, as you have mentioned, JPD, or now for most European scholars, we simply combine the J and the E, and then we don't even talk about them anymore. We just call them non-P, right? And then we have various levels of P, PG, PS. These are various sort of supplementals of the original source of P. Again, P has now taken, the priestly author of the tradition has taken a shape of its own. So when I was in school, I learned that the J text is dated to earliest like 10th century. E is like 9th century, and somebody combined it, and we now have a JE. And And all of this really took place with the Witte, who placed the D at the very center of 621 BC. And most of your readers or your watchers or audience can do a quick, nowadays, an AI search and get the history of this. And we have these interesting ways of dating the text internally based upon not textual evidence, but scholastic evidence that has sort of basically sent forth its theories, and either you accept it, you reject it. But there is some consensus among scholars that we have an early tradition, a mid tradition, and a late tradition. And so to definitively say that, oh, I think this is a 6th century text, oh, this is a 5th century text, that is so subjective. So let me give you a quick example of one of the most recognized names in the study of the Pentateuch, John Van Seters, who argued his entire life that the J text was a 6th century text, arguing against all those who are arguing for previous generations of saying that J was 10th century, 9th century. He is correct, but J doesn't exist anymore. Okay. So in other words, when scholars date certain texts to a certain historical period, everybody has their own sort of school of thought that they're using. But today, what you'll see is, oh, but the text is now Persian, oh, but with echoes of the Hellenistic sort of thoughts here and there. So for us to definitively say, oh, this is a text that comes from 621 BCE, oh, this is another layer of redaction, it is highly subjective. And subjective meaning that we're not quite sure. And for us, scholars, to simply say, oh, this is a text that comes from the 8th century. Oh, again, I don't want to get into archaeology here at large, but oftentimes scholars are dating texts in the way in which we've been trained in that specific school of thought. So certain works will be 8th century, certain works will be 6th century, certain works will be 5th century. Again, you look at a classical work like Siao's commentary in the book of in the book of Ecclesiastes, or Michael Fox's Ecclesiastes. They're going to be arguing for whether the text is Persian or Hellenistic. And so at the end of the day, when we look at the Pentateuch and we want to sort of date the Pentateuch to the early Neo-Babylonian period or the 10th century, or because we see or hear Ugaritic elements in the text, it must be early, or because we find these early psalms or early songs like Exodus, in the book of Exodus, and compare Exodus 14 and 15, and we want to say these are early texts, it's difficult to really articulate, oh, these are 8th century texts or it's a 10th century text. Once again, you ask a scholar to ask how they're dating text, everyone will give you a very different answer. So you're absolutely right. It's hard to really justify, a source being dated to a certain time period. The greater question would now be, what do these different sources mean? And so for those of us who study this and take this really seriously, the sources, now we've moved into studying scribes and scribal communities. So the text actually represents scribal communities, and the scribes represent different ideological positions. So if the J text is Southern and the E text is Northern, and the D is the Deuteronomist and the P is the priestly, you have at least 4 different traditions. What do they represent? Who do they represent? And so once again, I think some of the scholars are now arriving at the conclusion it's no longer a North and a South debate anymore, like Gary Rensburg, who till this day would sort of argue that there is an Israelite dialect in some of the Northern Hebrew and the Southern Hebrew. You can't argue that anymore. The way of thinking about the North and Southern division, it's gone. Those days are gone, long gone. The big question is, it's the East and West conversation. In other words, the Jewish community that's in Babylon or Persia versus the Judean or Jewish community that's in Egypt. It's a clash of 2 cultures, the East and the West. Scholars also have to remember, and your audience too, we don't have a hexateuch. It doesn't go into the book of Joshua. We don't have a tetrateuch. We have a pentateuch. meaning that the story ends with the book of Deuteronomy, and they cut it with the book of Deuteronomy. Why? Because the Pentateuch is binding for the diaspora community. It's for those who are living outside the land, which means that it's a reflection. It's an incomplete story because there's an argument going against into the land. In as much as the land is important, it's the land that has caused the issues and the problems and the conflict. So once again, it's rightfully called the Pentateuch. And Moses dies in the wilderness. The book of Deuteronomy ends in the wilderness. And once again, it's for the diaspora communities, for them to sort of hold on to these teachings that are sacred, and yet for you and I and others is as critical. I hope that sort of answers your questions. And again, in a sort of a larger sort of history of scholarship conversation.
Oh yeah, you definitely did. Back in Danibus, thank you for your super chat. Were prophets layered with revised history?
Yes, absolutely. So when we study the book of Jeremiah, it is layered. Everything is layered. The book of Isaiah is all. So many of our listeners, oftentimes I love, interacting with everyday listeners, because we have this idealistic, romantic notion where a text is being written all at one sitting. We have this notion where, oh, God says, Moses, I want you to write, and Moses is writing. Oh, Joshua is writing, or one of the prophets are writing. That's not how biblical consciousness takes place, or scriptural consciousness. One group of scribes or one person may have written a small section of it, and then the text actually grows. It grows again. So every prophetic text is growing. For example, the book of Ezekiel 40 to 48, Ezekiel probably never wrote that, but he may have envisioned it. Somebody else came along and added those incredible chapters on the formation of what that temple would look like. The book of Isaiah has a 400, 500-year-old history. The book of the 12, which are the minor prophets, they go through an incredible amount of editorial process and growth at large. So to answer your audience, that person who asked, is there a layering in prophets? Absolutely. In fact, we can sit down and talk about the multiple different layers, and even in particular chapter, there are multiple layers. So I can give you an example, like Jeremiah chapter 29. It's one of the most famous passages. We talk about, now here is God using Jeremiah to send a letter to those who are in exile, saying, go there. There's epistolography in there. There's letters in there. There's redactions in there. There's histories in there. And so that takes multiple layers. But immediately following that is the book of consolations. That book of consolation is one of the last things about restoring restoration. That is actually one of the last things that we know of that is in the book of Jeremiah. So how did something so late get into that sort of context? And why is this Jeremiah chapter 29 as a precursor or even an introduction to the book of consolation? So there are important questions. The other way that we can see certain elements that is early, middle, or late is looking at the language of and how the text is written. So let's give a quick illustration to your listener. If I use the word groovy, things are groovy, right? You're thinking of maybe 1970s, right? Things are gnarly, right? Things are radical, dude. Yeah, man, it's radical. It's cool, man. You're thinking of maybe Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure of the late 90s or so, right? So anyone who played basketball growing up, like if you hit a nothing but net, some of those who grew up in New York City will remember, oh, it's all water, oh, it's all sort of money. You hear all those things, but let's say that you hear the word Google or Facebook, but all of a sudden, let's say that you hear the word Google or Facebook in a 18th century text. Someone put that in there. There's no way that. So in other words, based upon the language, you can actually sort of not give it a precise date, but we can say it's early Hebrew, middle Hebrew, or late Hebrew. And we can actually see the syntax and the grammar. And there's times in when even the definite article is used with God. We don't usually say the God or the gods unless you're translating that. We can immediately identify that here is someone who is trained in Greek, who's thinking in Aramaic, but is writing in Hebrew. You can spot that immediately when you know the language very, very well. So based upon even our modern day language, you can tell right away what languages or what sort of redactions or what historical time periods. That question, are the prophets layered? Absolutely, they are layered.
Back and thank you for another super chat. Is it possible that the southern kingdom didn't exist until after exile, a unified kingdom led by the north, or perhaps exists as the northern exiled?
Okay, whoever this Pan is, I love that question. Okay, the northern kingdom did exist. The southern kingdom did exist. Okay, now here's the important thing. The northern kingdom's destruction really doesn't matter. Let me say that again. In 721 BCE, the northern kingdom Israel is quote unquote forced into migration by the Assyrians. The historical account is, 200,000 people were actually displaced and resettled up to the northern across the so-called Assyrian Empire. For all listeners here, this is very, very important. Anyone who uses the NRSV edition or the NRSV updated edition, and I help sort of work with the NRSV updated edition, if you see the word exile as deportation, that is such a big mess up for all translations of the NRSV. Can you imagine the exile being translated as deportation in today's consciousness? We're all smirking and laughing. Yeah, what does that mean? When ancient Israel, ancient Judah was deported, quote unquote, were they there illegally? And so now you're deporting these people, right? You see the problem that we have, right? Serious problem. And so early on, I was one of the North American first to say, stop using the word deportation because it's going to have political ramifications. As early as 2000, and all the conferences gave so many papers on it. On the European side, there was this guy named Bob Becking, who's a brilliant scholar as well, who said, we're going to have big issues with using the word deportation in the Bible. Look where we are today. So classical works, problematic works, use the word, the northern kingdom of Israel was deported. Okay, and they're going to say, but look at the word Oxford English Dictionary, and they're using the word neutrally. No, not today. The language changes. So you don't want to use the word deported, okay, with exile. So the northern kingdom is destroyed in 721 BCE. And we have this theory that some of them came down to the southern kingdom. That's where the Deuteronomists came down. Why would the Deuteronomists come down just to the southern kingdom and add their story to the southern story? So anyone that lives down in the south, if the northerners came down to the south, okay, and they sort of lost their homeland, and came down to the south, would you allow the northerners to overtake your southern history and override your southern history? Absolutely not. So what happened to these northern kingdom folks? They went further south, not just to Judah, because they were afraid that the southern kingdom would be taken by the Assyrians, but they probably went further down to Egypt, like the Elephantine community. So the northern kingdom is destroyed in 721 BCE, but the southern kingdom remains, and they get technically destroyed in 597, 587, and 582, but a group of folks remain. So, but then when the history is being recorded and written down for the first time, in order to ease the history of the destruction of the southern, now the northern kingdom's destruction makes sense. Now they're going to put it as a precursor to the destruction of the southern kingdom. In other words, unless the southern kingdom also got destroyed, the destruction of the northern kingdom would have mattered very little. Now that the southern kingdom is destroyed and they're homeless, they're stateless, and now they're rewriting or constituting their history for the first time. Now they're going to say, that's right. In the memory of the authors and the community and the scribes, they're writing about the destruction of the northern kingdom first, to ease the sort of the story. It happened to the northern folks. It happened to the southern folks and the southern community at large. And so what's the actual evidence of the destruction of the southern kingdom? We actually have extra biblical texts from the Al Yehuda cuneiform text that talks about up to 3 or 4 generations in Babylon. David Chauffeur's sort of collection. and that important set of documents from the Jewish community that's in Elephantine. Carl van der Toorn has written a pretty interesting book, somewhat speculative, called The Elephantine, or I think he's calling it something about diaspora Jews in Yale University, Anchor Bible series a number of years ago. And then again, another work more recently by Jonathan Adler on the origins of Judaism. And so the reason why I'm mentioning these two works is because, again, the destruction of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom really sort of perpetuates this whole notion of how the Bible came to be and how the scriptures were actually sort of founded. But centrally, Judaism doesn't really evolve without the destruction of the northern and the southern kingdoms at large. Okay, let me stop there and see if there are other questions.
I don't have any more super chats so far. So what I like to do is I like to ask you one more question about the source criticism, and then after that, I want to focus on Manetho, Osarsiv, and Moses.
Sure.
As you know, I am massively skeptical about hypothetical documents. And in my issue, and you kind of touched on this earlier, that there's disagreement about how many of them how many of those hypothetical texts existed, what we can know is in them. Then you have different opinions about, are two documents the same, are they not the same? And then there's the attestation problem that there seemed to be lack of evidence that those documents exist. So here's my question in regards to that. How can one be confident in reconstructing a hypothetical layer and then knowing that it looked exactly like that despite no manuscript evidence, no attestation, nothing?
And so in most divinity schools, I'm not sure about seminaries, I taught in a seminary as well too, during a session on source criticism, and it's a foundation, it's like a workshop, let's say after you're introduced to your typical source criticism, we sit down and we actually examine the text. And one of the source books that we use it's an outdated book, but it's very, very useful. Campbell and O'Brien's Source Criticism. And what you'll find in more traditional scholarship is they will take all of the so-called the J material and paste everything storyline. And they'll also take the E material and cut and paste everything. And then they'll take the Deuteronomist and they'll also take the priestly tradition. And you read the text according to so-called whatever these are, the sources that are underneath the multiple sort of compositional layers that produce the final form of the Pentateuch. And I am convinced, whatever you want to call it, scholastically speaking, read it in the original language, it just flows. And the storyline actually does make sense. And so there is this sort of, whether you want to call it a document or some sort of an earlier tradition, and I think that may be the better word, tradition, or layers of texts. So somebody has put these textual traditions together. In other words, it might have been, let's say that Jacob, you and I, we have two very different stories about our lived experience. But someone has later on, after you died and I died, they've taken your version and let's take my version, and someone has placed those texts together side by side, but they've cut and pasted it in such a way that it's sometimes hard to pull it apart. But then if you have good enough language skills, you actually reconstruct that. That's what we call reconstruction, not based upon just me going in and reconstructing a text, but reconstructing what that original document may have looked like. Then we have the story version of Jacob, and then we have a story version of John on. And someone deliberately put it together because they know that the community was so far apart initially. So in other words, the fact that we have at least 4 different sources mean that there were at least 4 different major competing propagandas or views, at least 4 different ideologies. And what the text really does is asking, the liberals and the conservatives and the people in the East and the West, North and the South to come together. If the text can be composed together, it's asking the community to come together. That's the function of the canonical consciousness. It's supposed to bring the community together. Oh, and how? Liturgically, through worship, through this text. If the text can be posed and composed together, can't the community also come together? And so to answer that brilliant question, I think we can see some of the scholastic layers and the scribes' intentional layers. So again, when you hear in the legal world, what's the original intent versus, I guess, modern day living interpretation? Traditional biblical scholars will always look for the original intent, and we can do so because we can see the history, the language, the history behind the text, and even what we call Sitz und Leben, situation in life, or the setting in life of how that text likely came about. So once again, it is somewhat speculative to some, but based upon close examinations of the text, we can actually do a pretty good job of being confident of some of that historical reconstruction and that textual reconstruction, which is very different than conjectural emendations. Excuse me. Conjectural emendation is going in and recreating a text. When we talk about reconstruction, we're just taking the text at large and cutting and pasting in such a way for modern day sort of folks to listen to be able to compare and contrast some of the ideas and some of the storylines that really do take place. So I would sort of suggest that if you have an opportunity, pick up an old book called The Sources of the Pentateuch by Campbell and O'Brien. And it's just a classical work to sort of go through to see the actual sort of work that a group of scholars have done. They're Australians, I think, that have done this work back in the 80s or 90s or so.
All right. We got some super chats. Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Are writings like Theocritus's Idylls, which idolize rural life and virtues from the same social or educational circles as the Pentateuchal scribes?
So all these value-laden questions are absolutely, I think the Pentateuchal authors were engaging. I think we can say that today in modern day sort of conversations, because the more you think about, okay, so let's give you a clear example. Okay. And so you all tell me if you think this is ethical or unethical. You have Abraham going down to Egypt, okay? And he's calling his wife his sister and, telling everybody that, here is my wife who is my sister for the sake of keeping his own life at large. Is that ethical or unethical? Same thing happens again to another patriarch. So when does ethics come into play? When we talk about ethics, we all know what right and wrong is. But ethics in terms of modern day consciousness, we attribute that to Greek authors. Until Greek authors are talking about the fall of human beings because of hubris, and there has to be some sort of catharsis, almost everything that we really do talk about in terms of these magnified virtues and becomes a virtuistic society is a product of Hellenism, which enters into the Roman world. Before that virtuous ethics that is clearly writing about ethics in the ways in which classic sources do, the Hebrew Bible tradents, the writers, are not really concerned with ethics until they're introduced to Hellenistic ideology and Hellenistic philosophy. Now, there might be stories of what created downfalls of humanity. There might be other stories about living forever, what is right and wrong in that sense. But in terms of these virtues that we're talking about, sure, I am fully on the same page. But in terms of urbanization and in terms of rural civilizations, those are as early, those are very, very early conversation subject matters that we can actually even go back to civilization stories of Uruk or even the Gilgamesh, or even stories that we see in ancient Egyptian literature. and Proverbs at large. And so the conversation about urbanization and rural settlements, they're as old as a story about Cain and Abel. And so let me just add one last thing. So do you remember the story about Cain and Abel? And you're now sort of saying, oh yeah, Cain was he was born because of with the help of the Lord, says Eve, and Abel's name is Avel, or Ken. So Avel meaning Hevel. Okay, in other words, he's almost like just an ephemeral sort of breath. Okay, but you have to realize what Abel is. Abel is a shepherd. What is Cain? Cain is a farmer. Okay, folks, are you getting the parallel? You have sedentary life versus nomadic life. You're beginning to realize that this is a story about class and socioeconomics. In order for one to grow, one sort of sedentary urban life or with land, you have to kill those who are nomads. So now you're beginning to realize that, oh wow, even as early as Genesis chapter 4, we have the story between nomads versus sedentary life. You have a story between one overtaking the land of somebody else or the property of something else, or it's a clash of different civilizations, the urban versus the sort of the nomadic, or what scholars would say, an economy growing. In order for one economic consciousness to take place, it's all about agriculture and farming, taking that land away from the nomads or those who are on the move. So I hope that that's the context. As early as Genesis 4, you have stories like that. So how old or how early are they? They're probably early, but you have these parallel stories about urbanization, or in terms of idyllic life versus these urban life. They're themes from early context, but in terms of virtue, in terms of love, in terms of jealousy, in terms of what is wisdom, what is knowledge, what is goodness, faithfulness, all those sort of virtues that we now tend to think about or talk about, they're inspired by Hellenistic works.
Back, and thank you for your super chat. Was a redaction made during the Hasmonean dynasty days?
Oh, wow, that's a fantastic question. I think you're going to find a small group of scholars that are actually just making observations like that. I'm one of them. I really do think that there are some Hasmonean redactions taking place. Now, why don't other scholars see that? Because they lock their scholarship in the Persian period, especially in the Pentateuchal studies. They can't force themselves out of that sort of historical guardrails that they have put for themselves. So I think, but it's always been the other way around. Oh, when you see the Hasmoneans, and later on the story about Judas Maccabeus being zealous. Oh, and you'll read Phineas from Numbers, I can't remember, maybe 25 or 26 or somewhere there, saying, oh, how that story about Phineas going and killing these a couple that is having intimacy or sex because of the Baal of Peor, and Phineas goes in and takes a spear and kills both of them. And now here's Judas Maccabeus inspired to do equal amount of so-called vengeance and destroying. I think scholars sometimes forget we can actually have late stories put back into an earlier version, retrospection, create stories of such to expand it, therefore, and thereby trying to justify their current day practices. So in other words, there are textual echoes. Okay, I can't call them anything else more than textual introspections or retrospections right now from the Hasmonean period being placed back into the book of Numbers. And that's where I see the most evidence taking place. The one last thing is, we have this thing called this letter of Aristeas. It's technically a third century text, but really produced in second century, that really speaks to the first time that the Hebrew Bible is translated into the Greek. And there's a reference to 72 scribes. Today, we have some more recent research that's been done in saying the actual number of people that have might have translated the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint. probably is only 5, based upon a dissertation that just came out on the Emmanuel Tov. And you can read that should you be interested. But the subject matter at large is, for the first time, we have a story about how the Bible is actually translated from language A, being Hebrew, into language B, which is Koine Greek, which became the dominant language. And for whatever reason, whoever wants to call this, it's just, Ptolemy II in Philadelphia wanted a book to be kept in his library. It's a law book, this or that. I think they're completely mistaken. I think this was a deliberate understanding that this is a respected religious scripture, canon, and it's a text of high value. And we have the first story actually being translated in the 2nd century BCE. Ben Sira is one of the first books that actually says, oh, we have an echo of a completed Bible. And then Maccabees also is restoring. So yes, the Hasmoneans are actually involved in the reshaping of the text of the Hebrew Bible. Remember that the Hebrew Bible doesn't close hypothetically until 70 AD. But the canon really doesn't close until 70 AD. Okay, so what does that really mean? Okay, for those of you who are Christians, there's this beautiful story about Moses, Jesus, and Elijah all showing up together. It's a transfiguration story. Okay, Moses represents the Pentateuch. Elijah represents the Nevi'im. Jesus represents the Ketuvim. The gospel writers don't think that the canon is closed. They think that the canon is still open. The New Testament authors are adding to the Ketuvim. That's why they create this new genre called the gospel, the Evangelion. Paul is thinking that the text is still open, and they're producing all this literature to add to the canon of the Hebrew Bible. The rabbis are saying, absolutely not under our watch. So as soon as the temple is destroyed, the rabbis close off the Hebrew canon to prevent the so-called this weird form of Judaism that wants to add its text into their text, and they're kicked out. They never make it into the Jewish canon. So again, all these Hasmonean sort of conversations, they actually bleed into the 1st century of the Common Era. Now, I have scholars and colleagues who say, oh, the entire Torah was completed by the time of the 1st century. Absolutely not. The text was still open. There's fluidity in textual composition. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, okay, they're a very important subject matter and conversation that helps us to see how wide and open the canon, the fluidity of the canon is and was. And for them, 1QS and the Damascus document are as equally important as biblical text and their scribal exercises. So yes, to that sort of interesting question on the Hasmoneans.
Bakken, thank you for another super chat. Establishment of synagogues create Talmudic edits.
So establishment of synagogues create Talmudic edits. That is a difficult question. So we have these things called open synagogues, closed synagogues. Synagogues, some scholars would suggest that it even began in the Babylonian period. So we have this guy by the name of Apostle Paul who's hanging out with this group of Jews out in somewhere in Greece or elsewhere, and they have all gathered by the waters to worship. And so by the time of the 1st century, you have someone like Jesus preaching and teaching in synagogues. And then it's only much later on when the Talmud is actually codified and written down from its oral tradition, do the Talmudic or the branch of Judaism actually take shape. But again, you have to remember, the synagogues were the only places that actually kept copies of the Torah. And you have to remember, ancient rabbis memorized the entire text, whatever the Torah was back then. And I'm assuming that at least, I don't think it was just the Pentateuch or the Torah that was around, but also the Nevi'im, the prophets. So they have at least the prophets and the Nevi'im all memorized, maybe a few passages. from here and there of the Ketuvim, which was still being codified. And so how much of the synagogues influenced the Talmuds? Maybe some, a little bit, but clearly by the time that the Talmud is completed, it has its influence the other way around later on, perpetually. But at the early stages, and we have some studies, scholars have done some great excavation work, archaeological work on and uncovering and discovering what an open synagogue is and a closed synagogue is. And so we have some beautiful restorations or reconstructions or discoveries of synagogues in Jerusalem and then elsewhere as well. And you probably know, a lot of those synagogues later on were overtaken by Christians and then eventually taken over by the Muslims. And so the synagogue itself is a subject matter of its own. How much of it influenced the Talmud or the Talmudic editing? Some, but not influential enough to say, oh, it was in that linear direction. Later on, it would probably be the other way around.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Exodus 30:12 states that when taking a census, each person must pay a ransom to Yahweh for their soul to avoid a plague.
Great question. So here, these are, I'm sorry to sort of say this the way it is, okay? So who benefits from paying a ransom? Think for 30 seconds. If you're giving money, who benefits? The priests. Oh, the community is sinning, and you are now perpetuating this whole notion. You have to compensate for your sin. You have to bring an animal sacrifice for your sin. Who benefits? The priestly class. Everything that you read in the Bible that says pay a money or silver or bring an animal, it's to buttress the priestly class. In other words, I'm sorry to sort of bust your bubble if you have this high respect, it's priestly propaganda. In other words, it's to uplift and to maintain and to line the pockets of those who are calling for that. So the big question is, did God really say that? Or is this priestly redactions adding into the text to sort of sustain their own economic welfare for the well-being of the maintenance of the priestly class? I think you can hear where I'm leading with that. So in other words, these are all texts. Oh, for those of you who are in church, when a pastor says, hey, the Lord is telling me I need a plane to go fly, to do mission work here and there, and people actually bring money for that pastor, is that really the Lord or God saying that? Absolutely not. You got to be out of your mind. But why do people actually give? Because they think that they're going to be blessed. So there is this sort of religious indoctrination that people need to be freed from. And the passage that you quoted is exactly one of them. You need to be liberated from a passage like that. God would never really say things of such. So now I'm asking for those of us who keep this text. So does this mean that the text is not inspired? No, it still is inspired. Is this not revelation? Is all the work of human beings that are in there to make my life miserable? That's not the point. The text is now canon. It is scripture. It's binding for that ancient community, for that ancient group of people who believed in all that. We get to examine them and say, wow, that's the way that they believed. It's an interesting way of appropriating or practicing their faith. Today, we don't do that. I hope we don't. But sometimes religious leaders have a way of manipulating their congregations using the text. And for you to be able to see what's going on, that's very important. And I'm glad that you picked up on such an important problem or question of such in the book of Exodus. Excellent question. Thanks.
Back and thank you for your super chat. Just like Greek rhetoricians, synagogues creating competing stories, we see a similar thing with the Gospels themselves, retelling of the same stories.
Whoever this person is, they really know their Bible pretty well. The Gospels in themselves, I know my New Testament as well as my Old Testament. And I actually thought that I was going to go into New Testament studies before going into Hebrew Bible. But yes, the Gospels themselves, they each have their own unique perspective. Studying the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as you sort of do your parallel studies, they all have their different perspective. And, of course, you're going to hear something called a Q, and, you have these ideas that Mark came first, and then there are source theories on how and which, then Matthew and Luke borrowing, and John is outside the Synoptic gospel. But then every gospel has its own growth history. Just like the same redaction that we talked about in the prophets and in the Pentateuch, the same redaction takes place in the Gospels at large. And so you have very different competing storylines. Some are trying to outdo each other. For example, the Gospel of Matthew, it's actually divided into a fivefold after Jesus said these things, after Jesus said these things. And it's divided in such a way that Jesus says that according to the Gospel of Matthew, 5 times. Why? So it represents the new Torah. Jesus is the new teacher. He's the new rabbi. He's the new Moshe. And so you have Jesus as this incredible sort of new teacher. And Matthew, by the way, Matthew is not the same Gospel of Matthew, is not the same Matthew as a disciple of Matthew. You need to realize that. Matthew is a first century, probably another Jewish rabbi, a pastor who's trying to educate his Jewish converts to this new faith called Christianity. And it may not be appropriate to call it Christianity right away, but again, Matthew is this, incredible teacher who's highly sensitive to the Jewish faith, who wants to bridge the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament studies or I shouldn't say studies, but the Hebrew Bible into the conscious sort of living embodiment of the teachings of Jesus. And you have this beautiful marriage. Mark, on the other hand, seems to not care so much about this Jewish tradition. Luke, new studies on Luke now tells us that he's really Jewish physician / a ship captain. But again, we have John, who is an original disciple. So the Gospels themselves offer very unique, different experiences, communities, and also its own textual tradition to sort of speak to the life and ministry of Jesus. But they're all unilaterally leading to one thing, to the passion of Jesus, and then the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. So let me tell one quick story about John chapter 2. In John 2, then, you have the first, what we will call Jesus' miraculous sign, or one of the signs of who Jesus is. And it's a story about Jesus going to a wedding with his disciples, and they run out of wine, and the mother of Jesus says to Jesus, "We ran out of wine." And Jesus gets a little upset, and calls his own mother woman, dear woman. Like, Josh, I don't think you can ever call your mom dear woman and get away with it. I know I can. I would never call my mother woman and get away with it. But here is Jesus saying, "Dear woman, why are you involving me right now?" And then the storyline goes, and then Jesus's mother says to the servants, do whatever he tells. And so that water instantaneously says, fill it up to the brim in their ceremonial jars, and it turns into wine. But that's not the real storyline, because later on in the so-called on the crucifixion scene, when the Roman soldier takes the spear and thrusts it on the side of Jesus, what comes out? Water and blood. And so that's what John is representing in that early end story, that this conversion of that water into wine is really water and wine, water and blood. He's actually theologically foreshadowing what's to happen. So John does a lot of things that is very particular. He pulls the cleansing of the temple to early on into the ministry of Jesus. So John is a theological, Christological statement. Mark does his own thing about the secret messianic sort of message. Luke does a brilliant job of trying to convey this humanity of Jesus and about the everyday person, the non-Jew coming to know who this Jesus is, the sinner and the Gentile really coming to who God is and to knowing who Jesus as God is. And then later on, of course, Matthew is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. So again, the Gospels in many ways actually reflect to a certain extent, the textual composition of the Pentateuch and the book of Isaiah. And so they have their own historicity and their own historical sort of lineage. I think we might have gotten off a little bit topic, Jacob, and so I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. No problem. Jay Warren, thank you for your super chat. Professor On, Plato's Laws, Book 10 says atheists and deists get death penalty. Did this help inspire the religious fanaticism of Torah, myth of the people?
I love that question. Okay, if you are at large, I want you to repeat this word with me, and it's not, you'll hear this, say mythopoetic. Mythopoetic. It's a combination of myth and poetry together that I use in advanced seminars, and I use this mythopoetic construction of reality. If you know Peter Berger and Thomas Lippmann's social construction of reality, there's a construct called myth. Whoever has the most incredible myth has the most technology in the ancient world. Your and my technology today is STEM, but in the ancient world, it was all myth. Whoever had the most complex myth had the most rich theological meaning making. And so in terms of the ancient world having atheists and non-believers, absolutely. You're absolutely on the right track. And so by the time when you have this sort of experience of destruction and exile and empires taking people on, the book of Lamentation, Echa, as we would say, there's so much pain, suffering, and grief. Like becoming an atheist or becoming an agnostic or walking away from God, it didn't happen just in the Hellenistic world, or nor does it happen just in today's world, but it actually happened in the biblical world. And so they're also engaged. And so you have these sort of wisdom literature that actually tries to engage the skeptic. You have, book of Job that talks about the one thing that really turns people away from trying to believe, which is human suffering, because you can't answer that question. And so absolutely, there's that incredible observation that you just made. And the Bible does deal with that subject matter at large, of those who are not quite firm believers and have questions. And the New Testament picks it up as well, too, in someone like Thomas at large. So yes.
Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Is it possible that the Tanakh's framing of the Messiah as non-divine conqueror was a counter-narrative to the God King of their oppressors?
Okay, so the Messiah in itself has a history of scholarship in it at large. The scholar that you might want to read is John Collins, my second reader, my esteemed, one of my sort of like incredibly gifted professors. He's done a lot of work with the study of Messiah. There's another work by Candida Moss. I can't remember. Maybe it's Candida Moss, and I think she teaches out of somewhere in the UK, and she's talked a few about, written a book about the Messiahs here and there. But historically speaking, in the Bible, the way that the Bible, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament presents the Messiah, David is the Moshiach. Why? He's the one who's anointed. Okay, then you'd be surprised to learn that Cyrus the Great is considered a Moshiach, a Messiah, a liberator, one who allows his entire community to go back to the land. It's so ironic as we speak today, right? We're in this incredible conflict and war with the Persians. And again, scholars and historians know that the first person to liberate the Judeans from captivity was Cyrus the Great. There's a reason why that he actually sent it's propaganda. Okay, don't read everything that you read and believe it. It's actually propaganda because there's overpopulation. There's tremendous amount of suffering going on because suffering in the sense that the underclasses are suffering. So his way of dealing with the inherited problem of overpopulation, health issues, terrible economy, not enough work, conflict, ethnic tensions is deportation, mass deportation. I call this forced human migration, return migration, and that's the subject matter of my sort of third book right now, forced return migration. And we have multiple theories on what return migration is. And we don't have to go into the subject matter of deportation. It's just massive deportation, coached coaxed in the language of, oh, I did this to free the slaves here. That's just his way of talking about getting rid of all the problems that he had in Babylon and in other places. Okay, because had he wanted sort of folks to stick around, they would have given him a choice. At large, the question at large that you've been asking is this Messiah. So then who is the Messiah? Then there were other Messiahs in between. The Messiah, biblically speaking, are we going to have a Davidic figure rule us, or are we going to have a priestly figure rule over the restored nation? So there's a split. Is the restoration, is the Messiah going to be a Davidic figure, or is it going to be a priestly figure? And you see this in the book of Zechariah. So Zechariah is really sort of struggling. And at the end, Joshua, the high priest, gets a crown. And now it seems as if there is this thing called a priestly reign. So this is exactly what the gospel authors are really struggling with. Who is the real Messiah? Well, the Messiah has to be from the lineage of both now, a priestly lineage, and you also have to have a Messiah from a Davidic lineage. So in the mind of the Gospel of Matthew, you have this Matthew chapter 1. You have this incredible genealogical list of who begot whom. And then once you get to the Solomonic, and then you begin to see all the kings listed in the Gospel of Matthew. And then at the very, very end, 14 generations here and there, at the end, you get Joseph. Okay, Joseph. According to Matthew, if the kingdom of Israel came back that time, during the time of the first century, the first in line to be the next king would have been Jesus' human father, Joseph. But he's not there anymore, and the list goes to Jesus. So now Jesus becomes a political threat to the entire Roman Empire, or whoever is the auspices. But that's not enough. Luke comes in and says he traces the lineage of Jesus through his mother, Mary, who is, remember, if those of you who are listening here, if you know your Bible and the New Testament side, Mary has a cousin by the name of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is married to Zechariah, a high priest. So Mary is again in the family lineage of a high priest. So in Jesus now you have this marriage. The Gospel of Luke traces it back again through Mary, which means that Jesus has the bloodline of a high priest. So now Jesus, according to Matthew and Luke, is a combination of a high priest and a king. Now, internally, he's a threat to the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sanhedrin. Jesus is now also a political threat to Pilate, Pontius Pilate, whomever, including Caesar. And so the marriage of this whole notion of the Messiah is this priest and king. I hope that answers your question. It should be interesting. That was a great, great question, especially during this high holiday for Christians.
And for my last question, and there are three parts to this last question, what do you make of Manetho's account of Osiris in comparison to the Torah's Moses? Is there interdependence? And my last part of that question is, what are the implications of the final form of the Torah being a 3rd century BCE composition?
Excellent question. Thank you. And Manetho, again, his work is kind of lost to us, and we see his work traced through Josephus primarily, and then through some other early Christian church writers. And the storyline, I don't want to sort of, complicate the storyline, but, here's this community that gets exiled or in place because in other words, there's a group of lepers and outcasts, but technically you might want to just call them ethnically different group of people, identity group of people, impure, diseased, lepers, whatever you want to call them, and they're all forced to live in one community at large. And so there's this sort of persecution against this ethnic group of people, or lepers as they're called in Manetho's. And so in that community of the diseased, the impure, there's this priest there, Osiris, and he's now become their sort of representative. And now he's going to gather the sort of the outcasts together, and he's going to now wage a conflict against them. And in the process of doing so, Manetho says he changed his name to Moshe, to Moses. But that persecuted group cannot fight by themselves. So they ask the Hyksos who are in Jerusalem to come down, and they come down, and then they actually wage war against the Egyptians, and they expel the Egyptians, the Egyptian powers that be. And the head of that Egyptian sort of pharaoh winds up going way down to Ethiopia. And supposedly this group of community or people under this new leadership who's taken the name Moshe, and with these ethnic lepers, whoever they may be, or just groups of people, enslaved, recently freed people, reigned for about 13 years until Ramses, that's whom we are suspecting the storyline to be, to come back up with a large army and defeat this group of people, including this sort of like quote unquote a Moses, an original Moses, before you see the biblical Moses. And so here is Manetho writing about this, and Josephus is writing about this, and the Bible sort of authors of the book of Exodus, they clearly know this story at large, and they are fully cognizant. And there are other scholars who've made these comparisons and extensive comparisons. And again, I'm not the first to sort of say this, but what's different today, even if scholars do know that this is a Hellenistic sort of product. Again, this is a late product. Scholars have been too scared to actually say that this is a late work. Why? It takes away from the traditional view. So let me give, if you read something by Israel Knoll, he's written some popular pieces in Harvard Divinity Bulletin and also in Torah.com for those of you. And he tries to sort of explain some of these storylines as saying, oh, now we can really date the text and the story to about 1180 or something BCE. I have respect for what he does because he wants to try to preserve the historicity and the authenticity of the Exodus story and these extra biblical stories in light of preserving a communal, theological, faith-oriented storyline. I have tremendous respect for that. For us to simply dismiss all that and say, oh, these are imaginary creations at large, and Moses, and you'll have some of your more progressive scholars say that Moses never really existed. These are all literary constructions of reality, and they're all fictional characters. I don't go that route. But the reason why I bring up this like 1180 BCE stuff is because there are certain groups of people that really take the text to heart and the characters to heart. And they take this with faithful disposition. However, or whatever spectrum that you might be in, there's a truth in that. And I say that with all sincerity. But to place that storyline in the 12th century BCE scholastically inaccurate, it's judgment from a faith point of view, and it's not scholarship for the sake of scholarship. In other words, it's a faith-conditioned scholarship, which is fine. And you'll see that in conservative Judaism, conservative biblical studies, evangelical biblical studies. They're all okay. They're one form of studies. But true, in my opinion, sometimes this is the hardest thing to do as a biblical scholar. Inasmuch as you might be practicing your faith, you have to allow the evidence of the texts of scholarship and the secondary works that we do in extra biblical studies to really objectively allow the text to speak for itself. And this comes back to Jacob's question. If you allow the text and the scholarship and the evidence-based work within the text at large to surface to the top, you cannot but come to the conclusion that the work is truly Hellenistic. You cannot date any of this stuff to the early 12th century or anything before the 6th century. But here's the bottom line. So the text is dated to the Hellenistic period. It doesn't take away from anyone's faith. It doesn't take anything away from what you might believe. but it actually allows that the text is a construction of a lot of conversations that's with other ancient communities and other ancient texts. And it's that faithful scribal community that preserved its own textual integrity and textual tradition, quote unquote, in its inspired state for that community. And so whether we date it early on or late, it really has little bearing on the faithful understanding of it. But what it does for scholarship is that we are now able to see that final third pyramid or the fourth pyramid at the very, very top, which prevented us from seeing that it's a Hellenistic product because scholars have been repeatedly saying, oh, it's Persian, 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 when in fact it's probably and more accurately closer to describing the final form of the text, Pentateuch, as Hellenistic. So I think there's more to be said. I think critical scholars have always been thinking in such a fashion. Let me close by saying I have a dear colleague in Australia. It's a conservative biblical scholar. When I mean a conservative, is an evangelical biblical scholar who publishes with evangelical publishers. You can know where a scholar stands by the publishing house that he chooses or she chooses. In other words, I don't work with evangelical biblical scholars except one when I did an article on the exile because I wanted that sector of the society of scholars to realize that what exile really is. But majority of my work is with progressive and academic and nonpartisan or bipartisan, whatever you want to call it. But that scholar that I just referenced without mentioning his name has basically said the Pentateuch is also Hellenistic. For an evangelical scholar to actually say that, to say that text is Hellenistic. Oh, and we're actually talking now, basically saying maybe next year in SBL, we might start a brand new section on Hellenism in the Hebrew Bible, Hellenism in the Pentateuchal studies. And so I recently presented a paper at the Catholic Biblical Association. I've been a member of SBL my entire life, but I recently became a member of the Catholic Biblical Association for whatever personal reasons. And I made my first presentation at CBA this year. And whereas I was presenting SBL since 2003, and from 03 till the present, there hasn't been a year except one that I've always presented at least two papers regionally, nationally, or internationally. But at the Catholic Biblical Association was my first presentation. It was interesting. It went very, very well. It was a very engaged conversation, subject matter. And when I did sort of give this sort of conversation, saying this is a late text, no one really said anything, which was kind of interesting. Even the Hebrew Bible expert that was there really never engaged the subject matter saying, because that's not his field. Because most of these scholars want to see and want to hold on to the work that they've done their entire life, which is basically Persian, Persian, Persian. And anyone who's published, we start shifting and saying, oh, the text is really final form. The text is really a Hellenistic product. Their scholarship is going to look antiquated. It's outdated already then, and they're going to take it personally. And so in the next couple of months and years, you're going to see a lot of these defensive scholars come out of the woods and saying, no, the text is Persian. Why? Because they've written and they've published, and they're not going to want to say, give up that easily. So there's that academic side. And the more that you have these scholars come out and saying, oh, the text is Persian, then you know that there's a truth to what's going on right now. Let me close by saying, early on in our fields of studies, there have been folks that came much earlier on. I'm going to drop a couple of names, T.T. Thompson and Niels Peter Lemke, Copenhagen School of Thought, and Scandinavian scholars who actually have been pushing heavily for the Hellenistic sort of writing of the text. They were on to something. They were absolutely brilliant in the way in which they did not allow any form of historicity to hold their objective view of scholarship, which means that they were on the right track of looking at the Pentateuch or the Bible in light of Plato and a lot of other Hellenistic literature. But I think what happened was they got caught in this debate between the minimalist and the maximalist, and things just went a different way. If we move beyond the minimalist and maximalist debate about historicity in the Bible and repoint and find the midterm of the conversation. Is the text really Persian or is the text really Hellenistic? You're going to get a compromise, and you're going to hear this word Greco-Persian a lot, Greco-Persian. But ultimately, the text is a Hellenistic product. And there's nothing wrong to say that the work is Hellenistic. In fact, it's liberating. And it actually is the right thing, because I am reading through a bunch of stuff that's been recently published by experts on the subject matter of the Book of Numbers. They're all saying, oh, these are all Persian, but it also has Hellenistic echoes. Oh, it's Persian, but it's Hellenistic, but I still want to date this Persian. That's such a contradiction in the work that they're doing. And some of these are well-known scholars, some are young scholars, and I probably will have a lot of frenemies moving forward, but it's okay because the text speaks for itself. So 35 years ago, I actually argued heavily against people that dated the text as Hellenistic. I went to bat to sort of like say, the text is Persian. And I still remember first major sort of a conversation that I had was in the Pentateuchal section. They were studying the Book of Numbers. One of the most renowned scholars at the time, a theologian, Walter Brueggemann, gave a paper on the wilderness tradition and said, oh, this is exilic or post-exilic. And I remember raising my hand as just a young kid and in front of like 300 people. I remember asking, but this is an original text. You can't lose the original layer of this being a wilderness text. And Walter Brueggemann, Professor Brueggemann, basically said, you're absolutely right. We can't lose that. So again, my point is, I'm not asking us to sort of throw away everything that you've ever learned and you're holding on to your truth. Build, layer them. And the final layer, the final few sections that we see in the Book of Numbers actually points heavily to the Hellenistic and even to the Hasmoneans as well. So thank you for this opportunity just to share some of my research, my thoughts, and my own journey as well too as a scholar. And so it's taken me 36 years to come to this point. Thank God I've never published anything on the Pentateuchal studies yet. It's coming out soon. And I still want to say thank you to my long, incredible mentor, Professor Childs, Brevard Childs, who is one of the most respected for his canonical work and canonical approach, including Robert Wilson. He gave me advice at a very young age. He said, sit on it for 20 years and you'll come to a deeper conclusion. And I sat on it for 36 years and I've come to a deeper conclusion. And so thank you, Jacob, for this opportunity to be with your community.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you very much for joining me. And when your work comes out, I'd like to have you back on to talk about that.
Would be honored. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for super chatting and watching, and I will see everybody later. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.